Welcome to the 7th fiction in our season 15 Fictions for Summer. Today, I'm talking about a book that many of us think we know. I thought I knew. I didn't know it at all. Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is one of those books that it's possible to know without really knowing it at all. In fact, it's quite hard not to know anything about it because just the title, the names in the title, have entered the English language and they're still used all the time today. Just a couple of examples from me reading the newspapers in the couple of days before I recorded this. I saw an article about what it called Joe Biden's Jekyll and Hyde policy towards Israel. I think that meant something like blowing hot and cold, nasty and nice, two-faced, whatever it is people mean by a Jekyll and Hyde policy or a Jekyll and Hyde personality. I also read an article about Jim Swinney, the new First Minister of Scotland, which described his transformation from his character as Deputy First Minister when he served under Nicola Sturgeon, and his job was to be her attack dog. He was snarling and nasty and aggressive. And now that he's taken on the top job, he's become nice and benign, and he comes across like an avuncular Edinburgh bank manager. And so, of course, inevitably, he was described as a Jekyll and Hyde politician. I think like a lot of people, when I first heard about this book, and I'm guessing it was at school, I never read it, but everyone had heard of it, I got the names the wrong way round. I didn't know anything about it except Jekyll and Hyde, and I somehow assumed Jekyll must be the bad one, because Jekyll sounds like a nasty name. It sounds a bit like Jackal. And I assumed Dr. Jekyll, the doctor bit, made him even more sinister. He's like one of those sinister doctors, like Dr. Frankenstein, another book that's known but not well known, because Dr. Frankenstein wasn't a doctor, and also people get confused. Is Frankenstein the monster? Is Frankenstein the doctor? It's neither. Victor Frankenstein was neither. But Dr. Frankenstein has entered the language as something sinister. Or Dr. Strangelove, or another doctor who actually features, gets a name check in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Fell, from the children's nursery rhyme. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. The reason why I cannot tell, but this I know and know full well. I do not like thee, Dr. Fell. Dr. Strangelove, Dr. Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll. I thought it was all of that piece. I was, of course, wrong. I discovered that Dr. Jekyll is the nice one, and Mr. Hyde is the sinister one. Dr. Jekyll is meant to be a nice, genteel name. He's from Edinburgh. It's meant to sound like a nice, genteel Edinburgh doctor, nice Dr. Jekyll. Hyde is, of course, on reflection, a much more sinister name. Hyde as in the hide of an animal, the hide of something that is dead, but also in the most obvious sense, hide as in conceal, disappear, be hard to find. Early on in the book, Mr. Utterson, who is the lawyer who effectively narrates the first part of the book and tries to unravel the mystery of the relationship between Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll, says of this man, Mr. Hyde, about whom he knows very little, but everything that he's heard or seen is really bad. He says, if he is Mr. Hyde, then I shall be Mr. Seek. But then to read the book, as I have now done, is to discover that it's a lot more complicated than that. It's not just a question of getting the names right and the right way round. And there is a real mystery in this book, but the mystery isn't really the mystery of Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde is bad. The mystery is Dr. Jekyll. What is Dr. Jekyll? Who is Dr. Jekyll? What kind of a person is he? And that's not clear, and it doesn't really become clearer as the book goes along. You discover more and more about Dr. Jekyll and this mysterious relationship with Mr. Hyde. But it's not clear what kind of a man he is. That, in a way, is the mystery at the heart of the book. The book comes effectively in 2 parts, or 2.5 parts. The first is the mystery seen from the outside. Mr. Utterson, a lawyer, and another man, a doctor called Dr. Lanyon, in different ways take it upon themselves to discover what is going on between a man they thought they knew, Dr. Jekyll. They are friends of his. In Lanyon's case, the friendship has broken down, but that this is a man they think they know. and a man of whom they know nothing, Mr. Hyde. But it all looks bad, and they can't understand what is the relationship between these two people. There's clearly something deeply intimate going on between them, but they can't make sense of it. And progressively, they unravel the mystery. And in the end, the unraveling of the mystery is too much for Lanyon. It kills him. He sees, at the last, Hyde transform back into Jekyll, that way round. And the shock of it kills him. Takes a few weeks, but he never recovers. He can't reconcile himself to what he has seen. And at that point, a letter falls into the hands of Mr. Utterson, which is the inside account of the mystery. That is, it is Jekyll's confession, effectively. It is his account of what has happened to him and how this story has unfolded. And each of the two parts of the book moves to a kind of pitch of horror. It moves from something relatively sober to something gothic and strange and terrible. In the first case, towards the death of Lanyon. And in the second case, the confession starts relatively straightforwardly and openly, and it gets weirder and weirder. So the origin story of Dr. Jekyll comes at the beginning of that confession. That's when you discover him writing more or less sanely, more or less straightforwardly about who he thinks he really is. That's the bit of the book right in the middle where Jekyll says, "This is the man that I am." And he says of himself that he has a kind of split personality. He recognizes that. He more or less says that he is in two parts as a person. But what he doesn't do is describe those two parts as good and evil, or even particularly as good and bad. And he writes it in quite a low-key way. There's no horror in this. And he goes out of his way to emphasize nothing terrible is happening when he describes himself as two people in one, because the two people in their different ways are simply people who have a different understanding or idea of pleasure. He describes himself as someone who takes pleasure from life in two different ways. One of the ways is by being a respectable person. He wants to have the esteem of the people among whom he lives, and he's a person from a very respectable background. He's well off. He's a doctor. He's a weird kind of doctor, not really medical, more like an experimenter with potions, hence what's going to happen to him. But that man wants to enjoy life by living in a proper way, because he feels actually to be a proper person is to enjoy the pleasures of propriety. And it is for him a question of pleasure. He definitely wants other people to think well of him because he feels more comfortable under those circumstances. At the same time, he's also aware that there's a part of him that seeks pleasure in other ways through, although it's unspecified, forms of sensual gratification, that he seeks pleasure by gratifying desires or impulses that at some level are not particularly proper. He does not describe them as evil or wicked. He goes out of his way to say, these things that I'm talking about are not actually terrible. And he says, a man like me could live in a different kind of way. That is, I could be someone who is more comfortable taking those sensory pleasures seriously. It would be at a cost of some of the propriety. But he says, I know other men who do that. And the word he uses is they blazon that side of their lives, blazon in the sense of they make a show of it. You can make a show of being a pleasure seeker in that sense. It's possible to live like that, but it comes at the cost of a reputation for propriety. And he describes it more or less as a trade-off, not a terrible choice between good and evil, between the moral and the wicked. But different people will have different ways of thinking about the kind of life they want that gives them the chance to take the pleasure from life that they seek. And he is a man who really feels he can't live without the respect of the people among whom he lives, the propriety, the proper respect that comes with being a decent man of the community. That's what he needs. And so he says that's the part of his life that he blazons, in a sense. That's what he makes a show of. He makes a show of propriety. But he can't escape the fact that he's also pulled in the other direction. And at various points in his life, he has indulged in those more direct pleasures or desires. And the problem for him is not that he is agonized or stricken with guilt or remorse. You get almost no sense of that. He's not someone who thinks that the pleasure-seeking, direct pleasure-seeking, sensual pleasure-seeking part of Jekyll is evil, but that it doesn't really work because each version of him stifles or diminishes the pleasure-seeking opportunities of the other part. So, when Dr. Jekyll is being good, proper Dr. Jekyll, he is slightly haunted by the fact that he is stifling that impulse to the gratification of more direct sensory desire. So he feels frustrated when he's being proper Dr. Jekyll. When he is being pleasure-seeking, sensory Dr. Jekyll, not Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll, he's aware that he is risking his reputation. So he can't really take pleasure in those pleasures. When he goes and seeks those pleasures, wherever he seeks them, he's aware he has to do it in a slightly underhand or secret way. He can't blazon them. He can't just go out in the world and take the pleasure where he finds it, because there is a risk to his reputation as a decent person, as a proper person. That's the problem that he faces, not guilt, not a sense of deep remorse, not a fear of evil, but he's not enjoying this life because each of its pleasures is slightly stifling the other. And because he's a doctor who experiments with potions, and there's not much explanation of this, this is not a sci-fi book trying to tell you about the science of human transformation into some other bodily form, he stumbles across a potion that solves this problem. And it solves this problem by creating a separate version of him with, crucially, a different name, a different body, a different name, a different identity. And that is the person who can seek those direct pleasures, sensory pleasures, without risking the reputation of Dr. Jekyll, because it's not Dr. Jekyll who's doing it. It's Mr. Hyde. Though, of course, as every reader is aware, it also kind of is Dr. Jekyll, because this is only going to work if Dr. Jekyll gets some of the benefit of those pleasures. He has to experience them. He's not just franchising it out. He's not just paying someone else to go and seek the fun. That would be no fun. So the solution to the problem is to have two separate people, one of whom can seek the pleasure of propriety without fearing compromise or, at the extreme, disgrace, and the other of whom can seek direct sensual pleasure without worrying all the time about what it might do to the reputation of the proper man. That's the solution that the potion, the magic potion, is there to provide. And in the early part of his confession, he says it works. It's great. Dr. Jekyll, the proper Dr. Jekyll, nice Dr. Jekyll, is freed of this anxiety about what he might do when he seeks the other kind of pleasure, because it's someone else doing it. And there's a liberation in it. That is the language that he uses. It liberates him. It liberates him by turning him into two people, each of whom is free to seek the pleasure that that person primarily wants. And then, of course, it goes wrong for reasons to be discussed. But before I talk about that, there is obviously a question here about what these pleasures are. That is, the pleasures that are described in the language of essentially a kind of bodily desire. They are definitely physical in some sense. And there are lots of different arguments about what's being described here. It's all implicit. None of it, I think, is explicit. Some people think this is something like an allegory for drug taking or forms of addiction. I don't think it is, actually. I think Dr. Jekyll, in the early part of his confession, is too calm in his description of it for that. It seems clear to me that this must have some bearing on sexual pleasure and sexual desire. And actually, I think fairly straightforwardly, it is clear that what is being described here is same-sex desire. That what Jekyll is talking about is his sexual desire for other men. None of that is specified, but it's there throughout the story. It's there at the beginning. So in the outside-in version, where Mr. Utterson, the lawyer, is trying to work out what is the relationship between these two men, it starts with an encounter with Mr. Hyde. Mr. Hyde is a very off-putting person. Everyone who meets him is horrified by him in some way. He gives everybody the creeps. The first encounter is when Mr. Hyde is coming back from one of his debauches, whatever they are. And it's not even described as a debauch, actually. He's just coming back from a journey into the night in pursuit of whatever he counts as pleasure. And on his way home, he doesn't just bump into, he more or less tramples over a young girl. And then he walks on. He's indifferent to what happens to her. And he's pulled back because a crowd gathers and they threaten him. And they say, you must make recompense for this thing. And he gives everyone the creeps. Everyone notices that this man doesn't seem to have any sense of shame or conscience. He seems not to care about what he's done. But they persuade him, more or less by force, that he needs to recompense the family. And so he goes into a house, which turns out to be the house of Dr. Jekyll. And he comes out with a check in the name of Dr. Jekyll to pay off this family. And Utterson connects this with the other thing that has been bothering him that pre-exists the start of the story, the one fact he knows about Mr. Hyde before this, which is Mr. Hyde has been made the beneficiary of Dr. Jekyll's will. Dr. Jekyll is a wealthy person. Part of his propriety is the propriety of living with money, and therefore he thinks it comes with certain obligations to behave in a certain way, to put on a certain kind of show in the world. But Utterson, his lawyer, has a will in his possession in which, weirdly, Jekyll says, if I die or if I disappear, I want my money to go to this young man, Mr. Hyde. And Utterson doesn't say what kind of blackmail he suspects, but he makes absolutely clear that he thinks the only possible explanation for this is that Hyde is blackmailing Jekyll. And it doesn't take a huge leap of the imagination. This is late 19th century London. This is 10 years before the downfall and disgrace of Oscar Wilde. To think that what we are talking about here is a threat of exposure of someone who is involved in sexual relationships with men, and the thought is that Hyde either has been in such a relationship with Jekyll and is blackmailing him, or knows of other young men and is using that knowledge to blackmail him, and has blackmailed him into making him the beneficiary of his will. And then when he gets into trouble, he can go into this house and he can extract money from Jekyll. And the imagery here, I don't want to belabor this point, but it is really hard to avoid. The imagery here fits with that. Jekyll's house, it's described in fairly nightmarish terms, and the whole topography of this part of London, of Soho, is nightmarish and gothic and mysterious. It's shrouded in mist. There are dark alleys. But there are also parts of that part of town, which blazon their respectability. And Jekyll's house is divided in two. It's the house that's divided in two. It has a respectable front that looks out on a street, which is not one of the really seedy streets of Soho. It looks like a proper house from the front. But from the back, it goes into the seedy part of town. And Hyde goes in and out of the house through the back way. There is a back entrance to the house. And Utterson says of that door, of that way into the house, that it is the blackmail door. It is the blackmail house only as seen from the back. And I don't think you have to dig too deep to at least suggest what is being suggested here. But I would go further than this, actually. I don't think this is just a book about what might happen to a proper man like Dr. Jekyll if he is also drawn in the pursuit of sexual pleasure to things that aren't respectable. I think all the characters in this book share those anxieties. So one of the odd things about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is it's a book about men. There are almost no women in it. The only women who appear in the book are servants, and they are effectively nameless. They have no personality in this story. But there is a group of men here, Utterson, Dr. Lanyon, another man called Enfield, Dr. Jekyll, and then ultimately Mr. Hyde, who form a kind of society of their own. And the other characters, the non-Jekyll and Hyde characters, all seem to be motivated by a kind of desire to protect Jekyll. It's not really spelt out particularly why. And Utterson is a really interesting, in his own way, mysterious character. He's a very respectable, proper lawyer, but he makes a kind of specialty of looking out for men who have got themselves into trouble. One of the phrases that's used, and I don't want to belabor this point because it would be wrong, is that he looks out for people who found themselves on Queer Street. But Queer Street back then meant people who'd got into financial difficulties. But he is also known as a keeper of secrets. He will look after people's secrets. But he's also tormented himself for all of his extreme propriety. He is described as a man who is frightened of himself. I just want to read one passage from the book. This is not about Jekyll. This is about Mr. Utterson. His past was fairly blameless. Few men could read the rolls of their life with less apprehension. Yet he was humbled to the dust by the many ill things he had done, and raised up again into a sober and fearful gratitude by the many that he had come so near to doing, yet avoided. What are these temptations? He's also described as a man who on a Sunday reads improving religious books until it's time to go to bed, and then he goes to bed with a kind of relief that he's got through another Sunday. And he is very eager to protect Jekyll. He suspects Jekyll is being blackmailed, and he's eager to protect him because he understands what is at stake here. And even when the horror of the book starts to unfold, he still has as his primary objective to make sure that Jekyll is not disgraced. And then there is the terrible crime at the heart of the book. So Hyde emerges as this character who has come out of Dr. Jekyll in the first part of the book, though we can guess it. We're not meant to know that. He's meant to be a separate person. And in his pursuit of pleasure, he starts to do terrible things. Initially tramples the girl, but then later, quite a lot later, he commits a murder. He kills an MP who's called Sir Danvers Carew, an elderly MP who's wandering in what seems to be a seedy part of town. And this is witnessed by a maid, a servant in her living quarters. And this is thought, therefore, to be a seedy part of town because the maid lives there. It's not the posh house. And she sees this MP late at night talk to a young man, a slightly creepy, sinister young man, and something happens between them. She doesn't know what it is, but the conversation suddenly collapses into violence, and the young man beats Carew to death. And it's seen that it's Hyde. And in fact, he leaves evidence of the crime behind him. Half of the stick that he uses to beat him to death is left behind. It's never said what the conversation was. It's never said what Carew was doing in that part of town, but it's not hard to guess that there's a sexual undertone to this. And indeed, even though it is discovered that Hyde is the killer, Hyde then disappears. He disappears into Jekyll. Jekyll is so horrified by what his alter ego has done that he resolves never again to take the potion and become Hyde. And he sort of feels he's got away with it. He actually doesn't have remorse. He thinks, thank God, this was so terrible. I now realize the risks I was running by having this dual personality. So I'll never do that again, but they'll never link it back to me because it wasn't me who did it. And somehow in the investigation into Carew's death, there's a sort of relief that Hyde has disappeared, that the person responsible for the crime seems to have vanished as though he never existed. There's some smell of a cover-up here. And I think it's clear what the cover-up is. It's interesting because it's almost exactly the same crime as the one that is the linchpin in the novel I talked about last time. Completely different kind of book. One I would say with no gay undertones. Phineas Redux. But in that book too, an MP is murdered late at night, walking home in London down a darkened alley. And in the two books, the murder is the same. The MP, in that case, Mr. Bonteen, in this case, Sir Danvers Carew. They're killed by a man with a stick who beats them to death. But then they couldn't be more different, these two crimes. In the Trollope case, the question is, was this motivated by a kind of professional rivalry, or did the Jew do it because the Jew is a bigamist who is also actually trying to cover up his completely different crimes? There's no hint of sexual tension. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde doesn't just kill this man by beating him over the head. He then revels in the violence. He stamps on him. It's a kind of bloodlust crime. There's no bloodlust in Phineas Redux. This is all lust. It's bloodlust. And it's terrifying. Eventually, the mystery is unraveled by Lanyon because in the desperate final throes of the relationship between Jekyll and Hyde before we get the internal confession, in his desperation, Jekyll, who's fallen out with Lanyon, finally feels he's the only man who can help him and arranges by a complicated series of letters to go to Lanyon's house, a man he hasn't seen for many years, and effectively take the potion that will turn him back into Dr. Jekyll. But it has to be done in someone else's house because he is so in the grip of Hyde that he needs the protection, effectively, of another man. And Lanyon sees it. And another thing that's never fully explained is, why does it kill Lanyon? Why does seeing it kill him, the horror of it? So it could be, and the implication might be, it's simply so metaphysically strange. Lanyon is described as a doctor who's very skeptical of Jekyll's mystical experiments, almost experimenting with the other side. And when he sees it happen, when he sees that it is possible for a human being to change in this way, and it is changing back from Hyde to Jekyll, not from Jekyll to Hyde, the shock of it and the horror of it kills him, even though what he's seeing is Hyde returning into the form of Jekyll. So it's not seeing Hyde come out of Jekyll that kills him. It's seeing Jekyll go back into Hyde that kills him. Now, I don't know, but it's a very small world, these men, and they are all afraid. The thing that really comes across in this book is they're all living in fear. Lanyon feels like he's living in fear. Utterson is definitely living in fear. Jekyll was living not in fear, but with enough angst and frustration so as to need to be two people. Robert Louis Stevenson, as far as we know, wasn't gay, but he lived a bohemian life. He lived a kind of libertine life, and he lived among artists, and he lived among people, some of whom unquestionably were and were known to be same-sex attracted men who were attracted to other men, and some of them lived it and some of them didn't. And in that time, that very, very frightening time, there were many different ways of living it. And it is interesting that in his confession, Jekyll begins by saying, there are many different ways of squaring this circle, of having these desires in this society. And unfortunately for me, I am so drawn to propriety that it's hard without separating myself into two. But other men could do it differently. And of course, there were men who could live that life more openly, but the risks, not just Oscar Wilde, the risks are terrible. I'm pretty sure Robert Louis Stevenson understood the fear that he's writing about here. In the confession, in Jekyll's confession, he describes the emergence of Mr. Hyde. And his initial description of this creature that comes out of him, or into whom he turns when he takes the potion, doesn't focus on the fact that he's evil. It focuses on two things. One, the fact that he's free, in the sense that he's free from anxiety about propriety. And second, that he is stunted. He is very underdeveloped. He is immature. And the people who encounter Hyde, they notice about him, he's sort of wiry and a bit misshapen, and he gives people the creeps. And you can't really tell with him, is he weak or is he strong? He's small, but he exudes a certain raw energy. He's described very much like a teenager. It's kind of like the adolescent version of Jekyll that comes out of him. Maybe the one that most strongly has these desires, but is also maybe, unless he can be liberated from propriety, going to be most tortured by these desires. Again, a number of critics have noted, and I'm sure this isn't a coincidence, that Hyde is described quite often in the language that could be associated with high moral Victorian books warning against the physical dangers of masturbation. Like, what will happen to young men if they indulge in that vice? They will get hairy hands and they will get stunted and shrunken. They will never physically develop. And Hyde is that person too. He's the shrunken, but also the teenage version. And he has the energy of a teenager too. As he becomes wilder, it's the wildness of a wild adolescent. He's a bit like a character from The Clockwork Orange. He's a bit like one of those boys. And as Jekyll describes the way in which Hyde's personality develops, the question with him is not to start with, how bad is he? Jekyll's not really interested in that. This is about pleasure. The question is, how will he grow? How will he develop? What kind of person will he develop into? Because he is the shrunken version, but also the immature version. And the problem that Jekyll discovers is because he has separated him out from any notion that it matters how you are in the world. He's a pleasure-seeking teenager. Because he doesn't have any sense of propriety, the implication is he has no chance to learn about or to temper the social consequences of his desires. And that's how actually he becomes someone who can only gain pleasure by seeking more and more raw gratification of it. And the gratification moves to violence. It's not really explained why it has to go that way, but the implication is it goes that way because there is no constraint, because it has been separated out from constraint. One of the really fascinating asides in this book is a moment relatively early on in his confession when Jekyll asks the question of himself, what would have happened if when I took the potion, the other part of me came out? So he says, I would have had to be a different person. So the reason that Hyde came out is that Hyde was the bit of me that hadn't developed. So the implication was he had repressed these desires. And so taking the potion embodies these desires. But he suggests he could have been a different kind of man. That is, he could have been a man who was much more open about the gratification of his physical desires. And there were such men, and he could have been one of those men. There were such men in Edinburgh. There certainly were such men in London. He could have lived a life where the primary pursuit of pleasure was that more direct kind of gratification. And then he might have been frustrated because he might have been aware from his Edinburgh upbringing that he was not satisfying the other part of himself from which pleasure could be derived, which is to lead a good life, a proper life, a nice life, for want of a better word, that is one that would be recognized by the wider world as a life well lived. The pleasure seeker gets the direct pleasure of the direct gratification, but does not get the gratification as being seen by the world as a proper person. So what if Jekyll had been that man, and the underdeveloped part of himself had been the bit of himself that he had not allowed its head, which wanted propriety? And he says, then maybe, when I took the potion, what would have come out of me would not have been what became a fiend, but an angel. Maybe actually I could have liberated from myself the angelic part. And he never says, but it is a really interesting question. What would this angel have been like? Because with Hyde, the point of Hyde is that he is underdeveloped. The angel would also be the underdeveloped part of this more pleasure-seeking man, more direct pleasure-seeking man. Would this have been a nice, prim and proper child? Would this have been a very moral person? But the point is, this is still meant to be a form of pleasure. This is the pleasure of being angelic. Would this have actually been a slightly disgusting creature in a different way? Not disgusting in the way that Hyde is disgusting, but too prim, too proper, somehow completely lacking in real physical drive and substance, a kind of weird little sexless creature? What would this angel have been if it is the mirror of the other story? If the libertine takes the potion and the angel comes out, what is that angel? And actually, I think there is an answer to that question, and it's not given in this book. I think the answer to that question is in the book I'm going to talk about next time. I think the person who actually answers that question, weirdly, is H.G. Wells, but I'm going to come on to that. In this version, the version where what comes out is what becomes the fiend, the question, as described by Jekyll in this confession, becomes the relationship between the two parts of himself, and how in the end what he thought was his liberation turns out to be his trap and ultimately his grave. Because these two parts can't actually lead separate lives. They each depend on the other. There is a codependency here for all of the hope of a clean break. There is no break. Each is implicated in the other. In some fairly obvious ways, as I suggested, Jekyll needs Hyde because Hyde is the outlet for these desires. And as he says of himself as Jekyll, he is very interested in what Hyde gets up to. And actually, in part, he lives through that. The thing about Hyde is Hyde has absolutely no interest in Jekyll in the sense that Hyde is not thinking, I need the pleasure of propriety. Hyde is the one who has been liberated from that. Jekyll still has the haunted memories of the pleasures that Hyde seeks. Hyde doesn't think, oh, and then there are those times where I quite like being a nice Edinburgh doctor at a London dinner party. He has none of that. So Jekyll says the relationship between us is very unbalanced. I'm kind of dependent on him and he's not dependent on me, except in one way. Hyde depends on Jekyll because Jekyll is his cover. I mean, Hyde is able to do these things without consequence because Jekyll will pay for them. And then ultimately, because Hyde can disappear and no one will think that Jekyll has beaten an elderly MP to death in a seedy part of town late at night. They will put the blame on Hyde. But Hyde can vanish inside Jekyll. So Hyde only needs Jekyll as cover. But it is a weird kind of cover. What makes one of the many things that makes this story so extraordinary is it feels familiar, and yet when you read it, you realize it's actually deeply unfamiliar. So this is not a story about a man who uses respectability as the cloak that he goes out into the world to hide behind. that he uses respectability as his entree into the places where he's going to do nefarious or bad things. It's not that kind of story, and it's not about an invisibility cloak. So it's not like Hyde can hide behind something that makes him invisible. Hyde is completely visible. People see him and they are repulsed by him. Wherever he's going to do this stuff, he's being seen doing it. It just doesn't matter, because ultimately, when the consequences have to be paid, he no longer exists. This is two people in one person. In a way, in contemporary politics, it's closer to the kind of weird, crazy, paranoid world of the wildest conspiracy theories, the kind of QAnon world. So to give an example, there are different ways in which people have, over the years, the people who don't just dislike her, but fundamentally distrust her, have tried to characterize the double life of Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is someone to whom accusations of living by double standards, of hypocrisy, have often attached. There is the version of her where she says one thing and does something else in private. She professes a certain politics and then she gives the lie to it because you realize she's actually taking money from Wall Street, whatever it is, that classic version of political hypocrisy. And incidentally, very early on in his confession, Dr. Jekyll says, the one thing you mustn't think that I am is a hypocrite. I am definitely not a hypocrite. These two parts of me are both genuine because they are both the genuine pursuit of pleasure. Now, the propriety part of me, the proper part of me, is not a lie. I want it. And when I live it, I'm really living it. I believe in it because I know how much I value it. It's just the other part of me is true too. I am genuinely two sincere people, two sincere pleasure seekers. It's not hypocrisy. This is more like the version of Hillary Clinton, the mad version that the QAnon conspiracy theorists tout, which is that she is actually two people. It's more like the lizard in human form version of conspiracy theorizing. Hillary Clinton, who in the crazy versions of these conspiracy theories is accused of running secret pedophile rings, not because somehow she is one person in public and one person in private, but she is two people. She is both this human form and the monster. This is what Dr. Jekyll and Hyde is. It's like reading a story set in the world of QAnon. It's full of that kind of madness, that kind of terror. It's like he's taken a potion that has taken him into that world. Actually, the world of more conventional political or other hypocrisy would be much easier for him to cope with because, as I've said before on this podcast, the great thing about hypocrisy is it's very manipulable. The hypocrite can play the double game. Jekyll discovers he can't play the double game because it's not a game. These are two fully formed, embodied versions of himself leading two completely different lives, which would be fine if they weren't also the same person. There is a version of thinking about how people, maybe politicians, people in public life, have double standards or are two-faced in some way, which suggests that somehow inside this person, inside this skin, there are two people. There is the face they present to this crowd and the face they present to that crowd, two inside the one. The much scarier version, the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde version, is one person but two skins, not one skin, two people, this face that way, that way, but two skins. That's what makes this book so scary. And that's what Jekyll finds so scary about his predicament. One person, two skins. Hyde, it's the Hyde. And it destroys him. It sends him mad. He conveys quite convincingly, Stevenson conveys convincingly through the confession, the disintegration of his mind. And as he disintegrates, he gets more and more confused about what is the relationship between the two. The language jumps around. Sometimes he says explicitly, I am saying he, not I, because he is not I. And at other points, he says of his other, it is me. Of course it is me. I am somehow implicated in that. I cannot separate myself from that. I have to separate myself from that. It's weird. It's strange. But the other thing that becomes clear as the confession unfolds is that Jekyll, not just because Jekyll had Hyde in him, but because Jekyll, is not a nice man. He is a creep. There's something profoundly disturbing about the character of Jekyll because at one or two points, it's clear that he really is profoundly selfish, self-centered, even though he's created a version of himself that has committed terrible crimes. He doesn't seem to feel that much guilt. after the death of the MP, what he feels is relief. That's all he feels, it's relief. There is the early mystery, which is Jekyll has written the will for Hyde. Now, Utterson suspects this must be because he's being blackmailed, but we discover he's not being blackmailed. Hyde doesn't blackmail him. I mean, he does a bit towards the end because Hyde is away, he has a hold over Jekyll. And the thing that Hyde is terrified of is that Jekyll will kill himself. That's the other hold that Jekyll has over Hyde. He could end this by killing the body. And if he kills the body that transforms into Hyde, he kills Hyde too. So Hyde has to keep Jekyll alive. So he mustn't do something that's so terrible that Jekyll decides to kill himself. It's a very complicated relationship between them. But early on, Jekyll decides he wants to leave his money to Hyde because he feels if he disappears, he wants to carry on living as Hyde. He would still rather be Hyde than be nothing. And at the end of the story, when Lanyon sees the transformation of Hyde back into Jekyll and is struck dumb by it and then eventually struck down by it, Jekyll says of that experience from his point of view, when he reemerges as Jekyll and sees what it's done to this man, he feels a bit sorry for him and he says, I felt a bit of compunction. I mean, he's killed him. He says, I feel a bit of compunction, but nothing like the pity I feel for myself. He comes across progressively as more and more self-pitying. By the end of it, you don't think Jekyll good, Hyde bad. You think Jekyll has been completely undone by this. As this has gone on, it isn't just that he was able to put whatever those things were into Hyde. And actually, early on, we're meant to think that whatever is in Hyde isn't that bad until it becomes completely itself unhinged. The bad emerges in Jekyll's response to the unhinging, because what he falls back on is a kind of self-pity. You don't feel he's particularly being judged at that point by Robert Louis Stevenson, but you also don't think that what you're being given is an example of a man who himself is in the end struck down by remorse. There are endless different interpretations of how to read this book, so I've given one, but there are lots of others. For some people, this is an allegory of a kind of post-Darwinian anxiety because Hyde is also described at various points in the book as bestial or ape-like. He's the primordial version. Maybe he's the ape-like version that we have inside us that we need to be careful that we don't let out. That's one version of it. For other readers, this is a book about anxieties of class and an underclass, the seedy part of town where Hyde feels most comfortable, maybe is an expression of an anxiety of urban living where the proper and the improper have to live front to back, side to side, and the way in which that unhinges particularly the people who are trying to live properly. It's been read as an allegory of a version of the Freudian understanding of the conscious and the unconscious, that Hyde is the id, and the id made conscious is terrifying. It's been understood as an allegory of progress and of the move from the natural to the moral or the social, that what Hyde is the pre-moral man. Hyde is some state of nature version of what it is to be human. Jekyll is the proper version. The problem with that reading, I mean, there may be something in all these readings, I don't know. It's a work of genius, this book, so it's capable, I think, of containing all these readings in it. The trouble with that last one is that what you can't say is that Hyde is pre-moral and Jekyll is moral, because Jekyll is not moral. Jekyll's morality is all entirely selfish and instrumental. He wants to be good in the world because it makes him feel good, and he doesn't actually distinguish it from the other kind of pleasure. He just says, it's really annoying that I can't take the maximum pleasure from my life, which would be to be able to lead both these lives, both to be respected and also to gratify myself in the other way. He's more post-moral than he is moral. He actually, in some ways, makes a mockery of morality as effectively as Nietzsche or anyone else at this time was trying to mock morality. There is some mocking of conventional morality and propriety here. Is there a political lesson in this book? So no, and yet there's something there, I think. There is something there. Because what any reader, I think, takes away from this is the hopelessness by the end of Jekyll's situation. Here is a man who wishes to lead both his lives in one person. And the only way he can find to do it is to become two skins. And it's not possible. It's not sustainable. It's a kind of dark magic, and it destroys him. It swallows him up, and it destroys the people around him. Even Utterson, who survives this, is never going to be the same again. It's the destructive response to the dilemma he faces. And it's almost like he's thinking, maybe there's some way I can kind of will myself to a way of living a life where I genuinely feel that the different parts of me can all be fulfilled. Indeed, that the different parts of me can be free. I can have the freedom of the constraint of propriety, and I can have the freedom of the license of sensual gratification. And maybe there's almost a self-willed version of this. The potion is like, I could be strong enough to separate myself in two, brave enough. He describes the first act of swallowing the potion as an act of astonishing courage, which it is, because he doesn't know if it's going to kill him or not. But he can't. There is no strength of will that will resolve this situation. There is no version of Jekyll's life in which, if he was just tougher, more able to live the double life, he's trapped by it. There is no separating out of the two. In these circumstances, force of will is not enough. But that's because it's these circumstances. This is a society, this is a way of life, a wider way of life, in which the two forms of pleasure that Jekyll wishes to achieve in his post-moral conception of the world are incompatible. You can't be the person who has those desires and also have the kind of propriety that he seeks. He doesn't suggest it's some kind of deep paradox. It's not fundamentally incompatible. And even Jekyll suggests there are other ways of doing this. He could have tried to strike a different kind of balance. It is clear that other men he knows have struck the balance in different ways, but he is also clear that none of them have squared the circle. None of them have found a way to achieve liberation, because the social setting doesn't permit it. This is the world of late Victorian England. This is the world in which Oscar Wilde, who after all chose a different way of living that life than Dr. Jekyll, is nonetheless destroyed by it. And he's partly destroyed by it because at the end, Oscar Wilde desperately wants to retain his propriety. It is notoriously and tragically Wilde who brings this on himself by taking it to law because he's been accused of being sodomite. It's a terrible world to be that kind of person. You can't will your way out of it, but you could change the social setting. In a different social setting, it would not have to be an impossible situation or even an agonizing situation. There might be other ways of organizing a human society in which a human being who both wished to have the pleasures of esteem and also to have the pleasures of sexual gratification could have both. It's not actually that hard, certainly for us, and I actually think for Stevenson, to imagine such a society. It was a kind of nightmare for certain kinds of people, of whom there might well be many, so not just people who are attracted to members of their own sex. All sorts of different ways in which people might legitimately seek pleasure are inconsistent with a very stifled and a very limited sense of what is possible while retaining the pleasures of social esteem. And the pleasures of social esteem are real. Human beings want to be respected. They want to be thought of as decent people. What would be the social setting in which that was possible? Well, there are lots of different words for that. It might require a kind of liberalization. It might be a libertarian view, a more live and let live view of life. It might be more anarchic. It might be socialist in the sense that maybe the problem is it is actually class. It is such a structured and hierarchical society that all of these relationships are shaped and distorted by the proprieties of class, the need for someone like Dr. Jekyll to seem to be above what is associated with a lesser standing in life, somewhere lower down the social hierarchy. Maybe a society which was more equal would also be one in which people who are divided in this way would actually not experience it as a division. A more equal society might be one in which it's possible to feel both kinds of desire for esteem and sexual gratification and to achieve the pleasures of both without feeling each is spoiling the other. There are actually probably a huge variety of political solutions to this problem, but I think we have a term for it. And I think it is the term that when you finish reading Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you are left with what is needed is gay liberation. To find out more about this series and about this podcast, just visit our new website, ppfideas.com. Tomorrow, on 15 Fictions for Summer, I'm talking about one of the great futuristic novels, H.G. Wells's The Time Machine.